My name's Andrew Copson, Chief Executive of Humanists UK. And this evening, we're very lucky to have with us Andy Norman, Dr. Andy Norman, who teaches philosophy and directs the Humanism Initiative at the Carnegie Mellon University. His work has appeared all over the place, and many of our members and supporters who are in on this call will probably have read it because it is in many outlets, very amenable and admired, very amenable to and admired by humanists. His most recent book is the one we're going to be discussing this evening, Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind-Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. Hot off the press as it is, and available at all good bookshops currently. I think, Andy, a couple of days ago, is that right? We're really avant-garde at this event. It was just in the last few weeks.
Yeah, it launched, I think, May 18th, so 5-6 weeks ago.
Very good, very good. Normal style of this, everyone. So you can start typing your questions in right now if you happen to have already read the whole book and you're already knowing what it's about and what your points that you want to have answered are. Alternatively, of course, if you've yet to hear the main ideas and are waiting for that, then type in your questions later. But do type in your questions, because that really is what greases the wheels of these events. Although, of course, as some of you will also know, at previous events, we've also found sometimes enough to talk to without getting to the questions. I apologize for that. This evening, we're going to make sure we get to as many questions as possible. Andy, this book has of course, as all successful books now do, a very provocative and interesting title, and particularly a title almost by analogy. It's obvious to most of us what immunity means when it comes to physical health, but you're using this device in a new way. So I thought maybe at the outset this evening, you could just sketch out for us the premise of the book and perhaps the premise of that analogy as well.
Yeah, happy to, Andrew. Thank you. And thank you again for having me on the show. So the book tries to address two questions. Why are we witnessing epidemics of unreason in our time? And what can we do to prevent such epidemics? And the answer I develop in the book is that, unbeknownst to us, for pretty much all of human history, is that our minds actually have immune systems just as our bodies do. Where our body's immune systems protect us against infectious microbes, our minds protect us from infectious ideas and bad ideas more generally. In fact, we had to evolve mental immune systems because the wrong ideas in our evolutionary past could get you killed. So what we think of as skepticism, doubts, it turns out, are the antibodies of the mind. They swarm to the scene of questionable ideas and try to remove them. And we need to learn to listen to those doubts if we want our mental immune systems to get stronger. Here are a couple other things about mental immune systems that I think it's important to understand. Every single one of us has a mental immune system that functions imperfectly, which is to say it lets in some bad ideas, some falsehoods, and it fails to screen and get this right, but it will also screen out some good ideas, right? And some truths. So we all stand to improve in this dimension. We can all improve our mental immune function. I'm sure to many this will seem like an analogy, and I think when you first encounter it, it seems like an analogy. But just as other analogies throughout history have actually become literal when they prove to be sufficiently useful, I think the idea of the mind's immune system is a metaphor or an analogy that is in the process of becoming literal. So cognitive scientists, and in particular, what I call cognitive immunologists, are actually taking this metaphor very seriously and finding that it gives us new insights into how the mind screens out, filters ideas. And when we view the matter of critical thinking through this lens provided by immunology, it turns out you see all kinds of ways in which we haven't been doing enough to protect ourselves against infectious and in some cases viral ideas.
Yeah, well, I think that's really, it's interesting you say that this is actually a literal device. You're sketching out as it were, a literal theory here, because at the end of the book, you imagine two future people in two possible alternative human futures, looking back on this present time. One person, one alternative future where this question of mental immunity has become this theory of mental immunity has become an accepted thing, and we've reaped the benefits of it. And you look back at this time as the moment when humanity realized, just as we realized in relation to immunology and epidemiology in relation to our physical health, and realized that these things were this proposition was true. Mental immunity is a real concept, and so we developed it and built the systems and rolled out the the vaccines and did all the other immune boosting stuff that was necessary. And I thought until this moment that was to some extent just a device, but it sounds like you really think that's real. You really believe that this could be an epochal idea.
Well, if I may say so, yeah, I'm sure it might sound self-congratulatory to say so. But look, when the germ theory of disease emerged in the 18th century, very few people could see how profoundly it would change the human condition. And when the science of immunology came along about a century later, it has saved literally billions of lives and allowed us to transform the human condition in ways that benefit us all enormously. I think that what we might call the germ theory of cognitive contagion, right? Bad ideas can spread like diseases, and what I call cognitive immunology, the idea that we can strengthen our mind's immune systems to prevent cognitive contagion, that pair of ideas, or that pair of scientific paradigms, if you will, that they could transform the human condition just as profoundly as the bodily versions of those two sciences. So I think we're just at the outset. The cognitive immunology is still a fledgling enterprise, but the more we take it seriously, the more we start to look under the rocks that it tells us to look under, the more we're going to see, oh my goodness, holy heck, I have not been thinking as critically as I thought I have. Turns out I've got a lot of room to improve. And I think this is true of all of us. In the process of writing the book, I discovered that I was falling far short of where I should be as a critical thinker. And I think the concepts and tools of cognitive immunology allow us to see that much more clearly, certainly allowed me to see that much more clearly than I had before.
Well, we'll come back to that, but firstly, just to push this question perhaps to its limit, I can see the not just the analogy, but maybe even the literal truth of what you're suggesting. But I also wonder if it could ever be as successful in as you say, as the physical bodily version, because if the strong incentives are on me, as there are on all human beings, not just now but in the past, to really get on board with vaccines and immunology and those theories, because I'm actually suffering and potentially dying if me as an individual, if I don't accept those things. So I can see immediately the utility of this bigger theory that is explaining the world in this way. But
yes.
do we really suffer so immediately and so self-consciously from the mental variety?
Yeah, well, there are certainly many mind bugs or bad ideas that provide short-term benefits for the believer.
Right.
So suppose that I don't know, indulge in a kind of an accusatory mentality to make me feel superior to someone else. I might derive a short-term sense of superiority, short-term benefit, but it leads me to say things I regret. Long-term costs, short-term benefits, long-term costs. If you study the way in which the kind of ideas that spread despite lacking an evidential basis, a lot of times they provide psychological benefits or social benefits over the short term or the medium term. And of course, as speaking here to my fellow humanists, I would venture to say that religious belief is a paradigm example of the kind of ideas that can spread despite their lack of evidential basis,
Mm.
in part because they provide psychological benefits, primarily to the believers. But I think we humanists are perhaps more sensitive than some to the long-term collective costs of religious belief, which is why we identify as humanists. I should say also that one of the implications of cognitive immunology is that all forms of, whenever you hitch your identity to a set of beliefs, you're courting mental immune disorders. So if I hitch my identity, suppose that my identity as a humanist led me to reject any challenge to humanism before hearing it out, right? That would be my mind overreacting to information it perceives as threatening. And by doing that, I might miss opportunities to learn about ways in which the philosophy of humanism needs to change and grow. But if you actually study this phenomenon called identity protective cognition, it turns out we're all guilty of it. We hitch our identities to certain beliefs that feel right and true. And when information comes along that threatens those identities, we respond sometimes defensively to the information and sometimes reject good information or valid challenges on that basis. And that can be likened to an autoimmune disorder of the mind.
Right. So an overreacting
exactly
immune system. Okay. And that's in the book, that's just one of the tendencies.
You might be looking for the word mental immune I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, but it looked like your mental immune disorder is my term for this. Turns out there are many disorders of the mind's capacity to filter ideas well. Autoimmune disorders being one class of those. But there are also mental immune deficiencies where the mind's immune system is underactive as opposed to overactive, right? And just as bodily immune health requires an immune system in the Goldilocks zone between overactive and underactive, in just the same way, mental immune health requires a mental immune system in a Goldilocks zone where you're skeptical or critical enough, but not too critical or too skeptical.
Yeah. And what are the things that can make us healthier in this respect then that we can do something about?
Yeah, well, so I mentioned before that doubts are the antibodies of the mind. So we have to learn to listen to our doubts because they almost always are trying to alert us to something relevant. And this, so don't allow yourself to experience doubts or uncertainty as unwelcome. Welcome doubts as your friends, as things that are actually trying to enlighten you about the need perhaps for idea revision. Incidentally, it's not just our own doubts that we have to learn to listen to. We have to learn to the doubts and challenges and objections of others, because a lot of times other people can see the defects in our ideas, help us spot our mind parasites, so to speak. And if we want others to learn from our objections, we of course owe them the same courtesy and have to listen to theirs. So that would be one thing I would say near the top of the list. The other thing is learn to treat your beliefs as stopgaps, as temporary, say, house guests of the mind that are likely to wear out their welcome at some point. Every belief is kind of a mental model that has limits. And if you push that idea to its limits, you'll eventually realize that it might be time to part with that belief. So don't get too attached to your beliefs. They'll prevent you from learning.
And you talk about gardening the mind. I like that. I like that image in the book. I sometimes talk about my mental spring cleaning. You know, that as a humanist in particular, you've got an obligation to be, you know, every now and again just taking a little, you know, running your finger along the along the mantelpiece and seeing what's right.
Yeah, I like the gardening metaphor because just as a good gardener will seed the land with the seeds that work well and weed the land of those that detract from the garden, we have to weed and seed our mental gardens as well.
And above all of this, and this is one of the areas where your book slightly departs, I thought, from the biological equivalent. you're saying quite, it seems to me, quite firmly that we actually have a moral obligation, personal responsibility in this area of our lives. We should be taking care of our beliefs, keeping them in good order.
Yeah, I mean, there's a prevailing ethos these days that basically says we're entitled to our opinions. This is an idea that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment, and it functioned originally to protect independent thinkers from authoritarian attempts to control their thinking. And so we humanists are actually rather fond of the idea that we're all entitled to our opinion. But what we're seeing in our time is that that idea taken to its logical conclusion means that we can brush aside our cognitive responsibilities, because after all, we have cognitive rights. Well, it turns out every right has to be kept in check by appropriate responsibilities. And this is as true of speech rights and our rights to our opinions as it is of any other right. So especially in an internet connected world, we have very significant responsibilities not to spread harmful ideas, because each and every one of us has the power now to infect hundreds or thousands of other minds with ideas that can diminish humanity's prospects.
So in that respect, it doesn't really actually depart as much from the biological or the physical equivalent as I thought, because you're really talking about public health.
Very good, exactly. So I call for public investment in mental immune health, or as I say, cultural immune health. So just as you can talk about minds as having features that prevent the uptake of bad ideas, cultures often have mechanisms to prevent bad ideas from spreading. Like think of investigative journalism, or norms of fact checkers, right? Online fact checkers. These are parts of what we might call a cultural immune system, and they need to function well to keep our societies healthy. And right now, with the internet kind of creating a lawless new frontier of culture, we see many of the traditional modes of regulating the contents of minds just not being up to the job. So it's certainly true that new technologies are one of the major reasons why we're seeing epidemics of unreason. But if our mental immune systems were strong enough, then I think we can hang on to the internet and social media if we develop our mental immune systems enough. But if we don't, we're in big trouble.
Is it just an accident of history that the internet has come at the same time as this growing idea that beliefs are private? You've got a right to believe what you like. It's rather cruel of me to question it, almost. Rather unkind to subject you to too much scrutiny about it. Or are they both sort of symptoms of a bigger thing? I don't know what I'm really asking. I was wondering if there might be some way in which sort of atomization of people and in one sense, and yet their sudden radical interconnectedness in another sense might that those things that we've just described might both be symptoms of that, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So one of the things the internet and social media in particular allow is for people to damage other people's reputations online. You can spread malicious accusations. And so that we've got a whole lot of people who understand that information can be weaponized. You ask young people today, a lot of them are just trying to steer clear of culture wars because they know information can be weaponized. And when that happens, of course, they're not taking a stand on issues that often badly need their support. So what do you do in a world where information has been weaponized? Well, I think the number one thing we have to learn is learn not to weaponize it. Well, one of the most important things we can do is always reason to find out rather than reason to win. So one of the culture wars aren't new to the internet age, right? Culture wars have broken out throughout history and they've torn societies apart. And what happens when a culture war arises and metastasizes is that people stop reasoning collaboratively to find out, and they start reasoning in an accusatory way to win. to defeat an enemy. So when reasons start to become weapons, or if you end up using reasons just as shields, weapons and shields, you've already begun to sow the seeds of your own mind's, the diminishment or even the damaging of your own mind's immune system.
You've become an apologist, really. You've decided what your what the position you want to defend is, and you're just adducing what look like reasons to defend something you're not going to change your mind about.
Exactly, and I argue that religious apologetics is a really interesting mix of religion and culture warrior, being a culture warrior. If you already think you know all the answers and you only engage with others in order to propagate your view, and you're not equally open to being persuaded by the other view, you're not truly a fair-minded thinker. Yeah.
So you've got the culture warrior mode on the one hand, and then you've got your counter. You're comparing that with or contrasting it with the mode of inquiry.
Exactly.
Are they the two? Okay. And you're saying that the mode of inquiry is the healthier mode. That's the bit you're adding on top. So is there evidence that it's the healthier mode?
Well, so there's this phenomenon psychologists call motivated reasoning, and it's considered a bias. It's considered a defect of the way people reason. So if you reason just long enough to prove your point and then quit reasoning there, we all have a tendency to do this, right? But it can become so pronounced that a person's reasoning can become effectively indistinguishable from rationalizing, right? But truly open critical thinkers distinguish between reasoning and rationalizing. They distinguish between, they don't allow motivated reasoning to become the norm or so habitual that they can't rethink. So I was going to wrap that up neatly, but
no, the point stands. It's clear. It's clear what you're saying. Here's a question from. We've got some good questions earlier on that we'll come back to, but there's a question here that is directly relevant to us. The point we've just been discussing is that someone is asking. Surely, though, what count as harmful ideas depend on your political or religious affiliations and beliefs. How do we ever get to verify or maintain a balance between different interpretations of harmful without swaying one way or another? It's as if they've read your book, because you actually deal with this quite explicitly.
Well, it's a perfect question, right? So anybody who wants to launch a science of mental immunity the way I do, and if I define that science as the science of how the mind protects itself from bad ideas, I owe the world a definition of what I mean by bad idea. And I don't mean just those ideas I happen to approve of, right? I'm not saying I am the arbiter of good ideas and bad ideas. Here's the important thing to see. We don't have to use the word bad idea to mean idea I just happen for possibly arbitrary reasons to disapprove of. What you can do instead is use the word bad or bad idea, or the phrase bad idea, to designate ideas that are objectively problematic, ideas that have causal or logical properties that are demonstrably reducing of human welfare, or right? So you can, in fact, bring a kind of a objective scientific mode of inquiry to bear on even questions of which political or religious or moral views are correct. And philosophers have been engaging in this kind of inquiry for a long, long time. When philosophers sit down and discuss right and wrong, it's not just a matter of opinion. You try to work out who has the better reasons. And the ones with the better reasons is understood to win. So if you bring that commitment to using the word bad idea carefully and in a fair, objective way, if you bring that to the table, you can begin sorting these questions out. Now, I'm not claiming that discussions with your political opponents will magically become simple and straightforward. But the only way we're going to overcome our disagreements with people on the other side of the political side is if we can convince both parties to actually reason collaboratively about which ideas are really the good ones and which ideas are really the bad ones. And the book lays out uh, how we have to think about reasoning, about collaborative reasoning, if we hope for those dialogues to become productive again.
Yeah. It reminded me, actually, in that respect, I don't suppose you would have read this book yourself, although you might have. There's a very slim book by a philosopher of education called Michael Hand called A Theory of Moral Education, where he sort of takes on the idea that, you know, that we're doomed because of our different philosophical or religious viewpoints to never be able to agree on, you know, a basic framework, for example, in his case, for moral education in public schools, which causes a very knotty problem of this type. And he goes about it in a very similar way to the way you go about in your book, demonstrating that there are, in fact, you know, ideas that are harmful or beliefs that are harmful in this. I hesitate to use the word objective because people use it variously, but in a way that can command almost universal agreement. I think is the, you know, it's pretty good, actually, and it's a similar sort of thing. So Zach should read the book who asked that question. It's a good question.
I love the suggestion. It sounds like a book I would enjoy enormously. And it reminds me of a couple of points I make in the book. One is that the idea that values are merely subjective, that idea has a great deal of plausibility because values seem to be the kind of thing that are in the head. And yet we interpret that same phrase to mean that values are fundamentally arbitrary, or, oh, well, it's all just up to whatever your preferences happen to be. No, kindness really is objectively more conducive to human flourishing than cruelty is. That's as objective as the axioms of Euclidean geometry. And the evidence for that claim is overwhelming. And so, yes, we can focus on questions of, you know, which art is better, and incline ourselves to believe that values are fundamentally arbitrary. But you can also ask questions like, which is objectively more conducive to human flourishing, justice or injustice, honesty or dishonesty? And the answers are plain. We know that core humanist values tend to promote human flourishing. And that's the reason why we're justified in promoting those values, because there is, in fact, an objective basis for preferring them.
And I think that a key humanist idea there is that which avoids that sort of false dichotomy between some objective and subjective standard, is to say, well, this is what's true of humanity generally. And there's a good quote in your book. You quote Napoleon, which is not a Napoleon quote I'd ever heard before. When you say, you know, when he says, there's one thing which is bigger than any of us, which is all of us.
Someone is wise. There's someone wiser than any of us.
Wiser, that's it.
That is all of us. That's right.
Yeah, wiser. And I think that's I completely ruined that idea with my bad quote, but exactly that idea is really very relevant to this. We've had a couple of questions in the chat here about actually, before we get on to those, I'll come to a question that's a bit similar to the ones we've been discussing, but you do address it in a slightly additional way in the book. So how do we guard against saying, this follows on from what we've been discussing, but it's not exactly the same. How do we guard against saying that people whose ideas we don't like are infected with a mind virus and need to be, you know, eliminated or cancelled? I think that's an obvious reference to current discussions, cancelled in some unpleasant way.
That's a nice question. So I readily acknowledge that thinking of your partner in dialogue as harboring mind infections is probably not the right way to think about them in the moment, right? In fact, you need to set aside this kind of your mind is infected with mind bugs in the process of being a good interlocutor. But that doesn't mean that there isn't another modality where we need to study the way in which bad ideas spread, and that where these concepts actually prove quite useful. So, I mean, kudos to the person who posed this question. I would hate to see the concepts of cognitive immunology become weaponized or just become used to diminish and cancel people. That they're not intended in that way. But of course, there will be people who will try to use them that way, and we need to guard against that as well.
You sketch out the antidote to that, don't you? By the mode of inquiry rather than the mode of culture warrior is part of the answer to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I treat that with some care, arguing that that if you bring the attitude of a culture warrior to reasoning, you're going to corrupt your mind's immune system and help to poison the space of public discourse.
You also talk about the value of persuasion rather than coercion. I mean, jumping off from this idea, I think it's as a response to this idea, this phony idea that's really difficult to deal with, though, that, you know, beliefs are private, they're mine, you've got no right to, make me feel bad about them. And you suggest that the truth in that statement, that's buried deep in that statement, is that, yeah, we don't have any right to coerce you out of your beliefs. Actually, that is true, but persuasion is a different matter, and that seems to be a sort of answer to David's question there as well. It's that, you know, you're not cancelling and coercing in the same way that you're not, you know, forcibly sterilizing or delousing people in physical public health. You're persuading.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very good. I think the contrast between persuasion and coercion is really fundamental to my thinking on this subject. Coercion is fundamentally robs somebody of a measure of autonomy. And as humanists, of course, we value autonomy highly. And one way to preserve that autonomy is to try, if you have to change people, try to use reasons so that they voluntarily acquiesce to this in self-transformation. In fact, if you try to use reasons to browbeat someone or to change them against their will, it just doesn't work. But if you can engage people in a collaborative spirit and use reasons to gently draw their attention to relevant considerations so that they self-transform, then you've actually helped them grow. And that's what I'm calling for in the book, not immunology-based canceling.
Mm-hmm. Someone asks, Nancy, if we don't follow the humanist model, one could argue that for some people to flourish, other people have to suffer. So doesn't it depend, therefore, I suppose, on how one values humans to begin with? And I suppose the suggestion there that is a disputable value proposition.
Yes. So there are many policy questions, for example, that involve trade-offs, more well-being for some part of the population, for less well-being for others. And those become enormously difficult issues to resolve in many cases. But I'm certainly not, but imagine a world where we enslaved 2% of the population to produce so much wealth that the rest could enjoy tremendous abundance and joy. A world like that might actually generate more overall human happiness than a world in which nobody was enslaved, but it would be clearly unjust. It would not be okay to enslave a small percentage of the population, to slave in the mines to produce wealth that the 98% get to enjoy. That doesn't work. So I think we need to acknowledge that fairness is a fundamental concern. And one of the most powerful ways humanity has come up with to promote an important kind of fairness is the notion of rights. Human rights, every human being has rights, and each and every one of us needs to be afforded the protections that those rights afford. So the notion of human rights is arguably central to humanism. Humanism, to the extent that it got going during the Enlightenment, was kind of coextensive with the idea that human beings have rights. Now, here's a really interesting fact about the concept of human rights. There's no empirical evidence that we have rights. In other words, the reasons for holding the view that we have rights have everything to do with the downstream benefits of the view and almost nothing to do with the upstream evidence for the view. There's never been a convincing empirical demonstration that human beings have rights, and yet it is a virtuous thing to believe and to insist upon because it tends to protect all of us. I mean, in fact, human well-being just skyrocketed in the wake of the invention of the idea of human rights. So I would argue that this is an interesting example of an idea that merits our loyalty for its downstream benefits, quite apart from its lack of upstream evidence.
We've had 2 or 3 questions about the concept of memes, and I suppose it's easy to see why people are raising that, because that's a similar sort of mind virus that where you could see there might be some conceptual overlap. They're various questions, but they all do have that in common, that they're about memes. So is the recent concept of meme applicable to this idea of mental immunity? How does the idea of mental immunology overlap with the idea of memes? Richard Dawkins and Susan Blackmore's ideas, as Susan elaborated them. And another question from Ian: can Dawkins' idea of memes be incorporated into this concept of mental immunity, as memes are particularly effective viruses?
Yeah,
or antibodies, I suppose.
Yeah, right.
Look at it positively for mimetic engineering to.
Yes. So yeah, I have to. My hat is off to Richard Dawkins for his work on memes, and of course that goes back to the 1970s. I think it was 1976 in the Selfish Gene. He in the early 90s he wrote an essay called "Viruses of the Mind," and where he argues that some memes, some bundles of information, certain behavioral tendencies can spread by imitation or by copying through a culture. And so he called for a science of information epidemiology to understand how cognitive contagion works. I read this article as a young philosopher and said, wow, that's a really important idea. And he also makes kind of a passing reference to mental immune systems, or actually he makes an analogy. He's like, grown-ups aren't susceptible to the idea of the tooth fairy in the same way that children are, which means we have a kind of immunity, or a 4-year-old who believes in the tooth fairy has a kind of susceptibility to mythology or fiction that a more adult person does. So this was one of Dawkins' points. And I was like, wow, that is a really important idea. We need to develop this idea that minds, in fact, do have immune systems, and that we can learn how to make them function better. And so a good bit of my, like the bulk of my professional life since, I've been patiently kind of developing this idea so that it can begin to help us control the spread of destructive memes.
Well, you'll be interested to know that Viruses of the Mind was first delivered as a lecture for Humanist UK.
Oh, no kidding.
It was the later article was a version of the lecture that Richard gave in 1992, I think it was, for the, as it then was, British Humanist Association's annual Voltaire lecture.
Well, I came across
he developed it and published it, I think.
Yeah, I came across it in an anthology that I was asked to review, and it really impacted me deeply.
Oh yeah, it was reprinted in the Daniel Dennett anthology, was it?
This was one called Challenges to the Enlightenment, but it may have been republished in other anthologies as well.
I think it's been given a good airing anyway. Yeah, he wrote it the year before he gave the Voltaire lecture, and the Voltaire lecture, I think, was just the next opportunity he had to put it out there.
Mm-hmm.
It's good. Okay, excellent. So really the answer is yes to all those questions. It is a directly applicable concept, and indeed in part inspired your work.
Yes, absolutely.
Now then, is there a mental equivalent of the R number for the reproduction of cultural ideas? That's a nice idea, isn't it? Maybe as this science develops itself, there will be. Yeah,
so I love the question. And if I understand correctly, so R is a value, the average number of infected people who infect other people. So if every one person infected with COVID infects on average one other person, then you'd reach a kind of steady state where the number of infected people just remains level. But if that number drops below 1, then the number of COVID cases begins to decline over time. And if that number nudges above 1, it can grow and eventually grow exponentially, right? So epidemiologists use this concept of the R factor. There's probably another word for it too, but to help understand the spread of diseases, but we can also, I'm sure we could use the exact same mathematics to describe the spread of infectious ideas.
Coming back to the bigger concept of mental immunity, we've got a question here. It's quite an interesting analogy too. Even bodily immunizations are still experiencing vaccine hesitancy from the population. Obviously, the same behavior. This is the question: will the same behavior not obviously apply to mental immunity in this respect? People are going to resist.
Yes, I don't doubt that there will be resistance.
Maybe even more strongly.
Well, at the end of my book, I develop what I call a mind vaccine. So I take the famous Socratic method, the idea of testing ideas with questions and seeing how they hold up. I take this idea and I refine it in the same way that immunologists refine inoculants to produce a highly effective vaccine. And I argue that I end up with something I call the new Socratic method, which I think has enormous power to help inoculate the minds of young people. But you invite people to put a needle in their arm and they often push back. The nice thing about the mind vaccine I developed is no needles are involved. All you need to do is learn the art of idea testing, hopefully when you're young. And by the way, it doesn't have to be painful, right? So a shot in the arm can hurt, but it's a short-term discomfort for a long-term benefit. So responsible people do it. The process of inoculating minds doesn't have to hurt at all. It can be great fun to learn the art of idea testing. And children love this. If you introduce the process of idea testing in a collaborative, mutually supportive way, it doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to be unpleasant. And you can acclimate people to that process so they don't feel threatened by it. Now, it's going to take time to help people understand this and embrace what I call the new Socratic method, but I don't doubt that we can do it if we all pitch in.
This links to another of our questions. Do you think it's possible to immunize children, perhaps with just one or two very brief ideas against future conversion to religion, or by extension, since your book is about any sort of harmful or bad idea? You seem to be saying that the immunization process here is not one or two ideas, but a sort of method, is it a community of inquiry type method, critical thinking plus Socratic method? Do you want to just sketch out your method for us a little bit, that you would have children learning from an early age, and all of us presumably learning actually?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, it is more of a method. So the new Socratic method is one way I describe it. I also call it the reason-giving game. So when I teach college students the art of idea testing, I say, all right, we're going to play a game. You hazard an interesting or controversial thesis, and then other people get to ask questions. And then we're going to track down what happens, whether the idea withstands that particular question. We're going to track it down by following the rules of this reasoning game that I lay out in a couple of pages. And then if other people have other questions, we track down those leads as well, and we find out what kind of verdict makes sense to render of the idea in question. So the structure of constructive dialogue or constructive idea testing can be laid out in a relatively simple, uncontroversial way. And if you teach people how to play that game young, it's not that it will magically inoculate them to all bad ideas, but it will give them a process that will dramatically improve their odds of spotting propaganda or science denial or wacky conspiracy theories, right? And notice that in the same way that bodily immunity is complicated, you can be immune to COVID but not immune to smallpox, or vice versa. In just the same way, you can be immune to Scientology but a sucker for alien abduction stories.
Yeah, right. It seems, this is a question, it seems that entertaining doubts and viewing opinions as temporary guests is really a case of a scientific approach where any theory is always subject to evidence to the contrary. Is that a fair interpretation, is the question? I think that is a fair interpretation of your theory, actually.
It is. I think part of what scientists learn in the process of becoming a scientist is that every thesis, even the most revered within science, are to some degree tentative. Right? Think about Newton's theory of gravitation. In a sense, it had to be revised when Einstein came along. And the same is true of every scientific truth. If you're bringing the right scientific attitude towards it, some philosophers sometimes call this fallibilism. You should regard yourself as fallible about everything, which doesn't mean you're automatically wrong about everything, but it means you need to be open to challenges or objections that might surprise you and force you to revise your point of view. But of course, that process only works if you're committed to revising your views every time a better reason comes along.
Right.
I argue that this conviction that each and every one of us has a duty to yield to better reasons, that's the linchpin of mental immune health, and the linchpin of constructive dialogue, the linchpin of science, the linchpin of civilized dispute resolution. We need collective deference to that norm. Otherwise, all of those processes and civilization itself fall apart.
Here's a challenging, and you illustrate that very clearly in the book with a dialogue you keep coming back to that was between Ken Ham and the American science guy.
Bill Nye.
Bill Nye, yeah, which is wonderful. Here is a tricky question. It's quite a long one too. So let's give it due thought. Mm-hmm. Can this mental immunity not work against you too? I've been so programmed through my ex-religious and family background to always be open to other ideas and opinions so as to ensure you're not stubborn, closed-minded, shutting others out, etc. But this means my brain is easily hacked by being called unreasonable and being told I have further areas that need self-development, leaving me open to control by others in particular contexts. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, it's
a real thing that can happen.
It's a lovely question, right? So the body's immune system needs to distinguish between friend and foe. Yeah, it needs to be able to spot infectious microbes that might damage the body, but it needs to allow nutrients and beneficial bacteria to thrive within the body, right? And the mind's immune system has to pull off a similar balancing act. It has to let in good ideas, let in truths, but it also has to screen out falsehoods and bad ideas. And think about it in very simple terms. So imagine you adopted the view that everything is wrong. You'd become instantly, and you adopted that and took that view very seriously. You'd get very good at screening out bad ideas, but you'd get very bad at letting in good ones. Right? That would not represent mental immune health. That would be too skeptical for your own good. Right? Or alternatively, imagine the idea, believe everything you think. Right? On the other extreme, if you did that, you'd get very good at letting in true, good ideas, but you'd get very bad at screening out good ones. I'm sorry, very bad at screening out bad ones. Right? So mental immune health is always a matter of keeping suspicion and trust in a healthy balance. I think we humanists are sometimes we refer to ourselves as skeptics. And I think that has the danger of inducing us to be too skeptical for our own good.
So I think that's interesting, and I think it's interesting that you've got at least one chapter, or maybe more. I haven't quite got to the end of the book yet, about how reasons actually work, like what it is, the process, which I think is very interesting, because that is an important part of any immune response, is to understand what the mechanism is, why is this actually working, and I think the person who asked this question, I recommend that chapter and the others in the book for this very reason, is that the mechanism of how and why reasons work and what it is that's going on when you accept that, when your mind accepts that, I think is very much to the point of this question.
Yeah, in the book, I argued that reasons are like levers, that they're involve sounds or written words that push against the contents of the mind, or pry against the contents of the mind, sometimes to shoehorn ideas in, other times to pry bad ideas out. But reasons can only function properly as levers if there's a fulcrum. And the fulcrum is the idea that we need to always yield to better reasons. Without that as a fixed point around which we dialogue, around which our inquiries function, reasons can't work to change minds in the way that they must.
Two questions that are linked, although slightly different, but both of which lead us into an interesting area that you do at least begin to cover in the book. Like I said, I don't know whether you continue to cover it, but one here from Peter: what do you think about the benefits of different political systems, more or less authoritarian regimes, for example? And then another question from Adrian on the so it's just disappeared off my screen. Oh, there it is again, which is sort of similar. Is there a political conclusion we can draw from all this?
Yeah, I mean, the book argues that if we back away from our, if we back away from divisive political questions and learn how to dialogue together in a fruitful way, and then come back to the divisive political issues, we'll be much better positioned to resolve those questions constructively. So that's kind of the program of the book. Now, I believe that if we do that collectively, and I invite people from religious, secular, conservative, liberal, people of all kinds to engage, to learn that process, engage in it, and then let's just see where the dialogue goes. Let's just see what the verdict of collaborative inquiry yields. Now, I have ideas about where I think such inquiry goes, and I think that, say, the democratic socialist form of government proves to be more conducive to human flourishing than authoritarianism, for example. I think I can demonstrate that. I think many philosophers have demonstrated that, certainly to the satisfaction of experts. But of course, there are yahoos out there who are not yet convinced, but our ability to persuade them is a practical problem more than it is an obstacle to our recognizing the cogency of those arguments. I hope that addresses the question. I guess it's got to be. Yeah, I don't want to put out a full-blown argument for democratic socialism in this point. That would be an argument for another day, right? There
would be other systems that might supply, other political systems that might supply the same outcomes. So it's your outcomes that are mattering here, presumably.
Outcomes matter, and the preservation of human autonomy matters. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. I think in some ways the axiom of all ethics is that creaturely well-being matters. If you want a naturalistic ethics, an ethics grounded in this world rather than another, you have to start with the idea that sentient creatures can suffer and experience joy, and that the whole point of ethics is to try to minimize the suffering and maximize the joy, but also in a way that allows all sentient creatures to experience the benefits of such efforts.
See, I was wondering if you were going to answer the question almost in a process way, to say, well, this all implies that the political institutions we're going to have need to be open and deliberative and grassroots, and is that what you're saying?
So I'm enough of a follower of the ancient sage Epicurus and Socrates to think that the deliberation and contemplation need to be a much bigger part of our lives if we want to thrive. So we've somehow built a world in which where we're doing everything at such a breakneck pace that it's hard to find time to think and deliberate together. But I actually
here's a direct question about that from someone, from Adrian, saying the UK political and justice systems are both based on this adversarial model, And that's so true in the English-speaking world generally, actually. I mean, we even get it in our media. You know, the BBC, for example, if they're addressing a topic, they get someone for and someone against. You know, someone of one opinion and someone of the opposite opinion. It's written into our culture in various ways, isn't it? This questioner wants to know: would we benefit, in fact, from moving to a system based more on a search for better answers collaboratively?
Wow, boy, you get some wonderful questions here.
They're all good questions here.
My hat's off to your group. So I do think so. David Hume, one of your countrymen, going back a few centuries, said that the truth springs from arguments among.
He's Scottish, actually, but.
Sorry, not a countryman, a fellow member of the British Isles.
Fellow citizen, yes, yeah.
Citizens of the British Isles. Okay, fair enough. He was Scottish, that's right. Well, he said that the truth springs from arguments among friends. Now, notice that in that formulation, he captures, in the word argument, suggests that the adversarial clash of ideas is important for the discovery of truth. But because it's among friends, an underlying cooperativeness prevails. I think he was deeply right about that. When the Catholic Church did away with the devil's advocate, so when candidates for sainthood would come before the Vatican, somebody would be appointed the devil's advocate to argue the no, he or she should not be sainted, our position. And for a long, long time, I think the Catholic Church sainted an average of, I don't know, one or a few people a year. And then John Paul II did away with the devil's advocate. And all of a sudden, we have like dozens or hundreds of people getting sainted every year. Okay. He's opened the floodgates, right, to possibly non-saints being sanctified in that way. So we do know that there's an element of adversarial, or there's an element of competition in the best idea testing, but it's always constrained. If my view is right in the book, it has to be governed by an underlying collaborative ethos, by a spirit of cooperation. And it's keeping the collaborative and the cooperative in a constructive tension. That's the real secret to mental immune health.
Like you say, that's the humanist spirit. You may be right and I may be wrong, and together we'll get to the answer.
I love it.
We can. Yeah.
I love it.
Well, we've got lots of comments, which I'm not going to go to because we haven't got the time for them, because we're almost out of time. But we have got one last question on the board, as distinct from the various comments, which are all very valuable as well, actually. But the last question then, do you think, and this is an important question because it is almost the premise of at least the importance of your book, do you think that conspiracy thinking is getting worse, or is it just more apparent?
Yeah, well, I only have impressions to work on here rather than data. It certainly seems as though conspiracy thinking is becoming more prevalent. And some of the things I've read suggest that many people feel as though their lives are out of control now. And when they feel that way, they're more open, more susceptible to conspiracy thinking. I also argue in the book that we've done a whole lot to damage and neglect our mental immune systems in recent decades, and that we need to restore our mental immune health to reduce among other things, reduce our susceptibility to conspiracy thinking. So I hope it's not spiking in our time, but I fear it is. And just anecdotally, it seems as though conspiracy thinking is metastasizing here in the US. So yes, I'm deeply worried about this. And I think that the solution is to understand how mental immune systems work, figure out how to make them work better, which is why we all need to support the new science of cognitive immunology and its application to ordinary, everyday idea assessment tasks.
Andy, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone on this call, buy this book or borrow it from a library, of course. It is really enjoyable, very radical, and yet very much in keeping with the grain of humanist thinking throughout time. So it's a perfect book to enjoy this summer. Thank you very much for joining us, Andy.
Thank you, Andrew.
And good evening, everybody. Goodbye.